All right, so you know who I am, and I know who most of you are now, and I'm really happy that Melissa took the time to thank Bibiana, because Bibiana's exhibition, you must see it, it's really fabulous, and it's part of a multi-venue series of exhibitions she's doing. And the fact that she is able to find so many fabulous artists who all are concerned with what's happening to our environment really reminds us of the horrors that we might be facing. And artists are always of their time. That's going to be a theme as I talk about art history, because we're going to see art change a lot. I'm going back to the late Middle Ages and coming up to the present, the here and now. And art changes because so much of society changes. And so there's always, in my mind, a way that you can look at great art and understand that it's not just the creation of the individual artist, it's a reflection of other aspects of society. So that's one of the themes I'm going to address. I'm going to culminate with artists who address climate change, but I'm giving you an overview. I'm an art historian by education. The academic background Melissa described was all art history because I was too afraid to become an artist. It's scary to call yourself an artist. So it took me until my late 30s to understand that the art I was doing was as important as the art history I was doing as well. So I'm both an artist and an art historian. So, as you know, the title that this lecture was advertised with is Landscape in Art. But I have to be honest and say we're going to dim the lights, yes. We're really just doing landscape in Western art. As it is, this is just a thumbnail sketch of landscape in Western art. I don't have the time or the expertise, really, to address landscape in other cultures. But don't think that other cultures weren't doing landscape art, very important landscape art. I just don't know enough to talk to you about it, and I don't have enough time anyway. So we're going to be talking about art in Western Europe and art in the United States and address the theme of landscape. Now, for many people who haven't studied much about the history of art, no criticism, just pointing out, you might assume that landscape painting has always been around and just take it for granted that landscape painting is a reasonable thing to pursue. But such is not the case at all. Now, we can look back to our own region and say, well, there has been landscape painting since the 19th century. The very, very famous Hudson River School really reminds us of the beautiful area in which we live. But that's the 19th century. If we want to go back, we'll find no landscape painting. For example, if we look at late medieval art, we find that art was a product of a particular time and place, as I said it always is, and art was a reflection of the power structure. And the power structure was really based in the church. So if you were an artist, you weren't sitting in your loft space making art that you wanted to make, you were working for the church. We often think of an artist as an independent soul who does what he or she or they want to do, and that is not true in every culture or in every century. For a long time, artists were craftsmen who were hired to do something. So if we look, for example, at a late medieval piece that I happen to love, this is a spectacular, fascinating piece of art. It's an altar piece. It has a typical gold leaf background. Now, why would an artist want to spend all that time and effort and money to create a gold leaf background? This was art for the church, and the church was willing to put money into art that would express the power of the church, the importance of these holy figures. So most religious art, the late medieval period, will have a gold leaf background, which is not very naturalistic. I don't know about you, but when I go out in the world, I don't see a gold leaf background very much. Nor can we say that this figure is very realistic. He's way too tall, and he also has no volume. He's flat. We don't have any sense of a body underneath those robes. He is St. Francis, and this altarpiece honoring St. Francis is going to teach us. Art was not for the expression of the artist. Art was for the church, and art was to teach the masses of people who were illiterate. And if they were going to learn what the church wanted them to learn, they would have to learn it from visual imagery. And so if you want to know more about St. Francis, you can look at the details, the side panels. Let's look at one of them. And we see that St. Francis was preaching to the birds. You might have heard that story. And so we have St. Francis and some of his other monks, and St. Francis is preaching to the birds. And so we know we're looking at part of a landscape because we see the birds. And we're going to have to guess that those are trees and those are a mountain. But they don't really look much like trees and a mountain, do they? Right? Does that mean the artist, Berlinguer, was a bad artist and couldn't do it? No. It means that that was not important. Giving a realistic representation of the world was not on the agenda. It was not what made you an important artist that the church wanted to hire. The church wanted to hire you if you could tell the religious story in a convincing way, using the stylistic devices that were part of that era. So everything changes with the art of the Italian Renaissance. So let me just ask, if I say Italian Renaissance, can anybody name an artist that you know to have come from the Italian Renaissance off the top of your head? Thank you. Who said Michelangelo? 2 stars, 3 stars, 5 stars, whatever you're supposed to get. Yes, Michelangelo. That's often what we think of when we think of the Italian Renaissance. And if we think of Michelangelo, we often think of the David. Well, what an incredible change if we look at St. Francis and we look at Michelangelo. Both are religious characters. We've got David and we've got St. Francis. But we certainly have new interests. In the Italian Renaissance, well, there are all kinds of reasons, but we have a new interest in the human body. Largely because one of the things the people were doing was digging up old ancient ruins and finding, well, as they were constructing things, they would dig up foundations for buildings and find amazing statues by the Greeks and Romans and realize that, wow, artists can do this. Because this sort of close anatomical detail existed in the Greek and Roman periods, but it had been cast aside when the Catholic Church wanted art to do something else. The Catholic Church certainly did not want to glorify the nude body. That was paganism, right? So you have an art on the left that fulfills the needs of its period, and you have an art on the right that really represents so much that is new. The Italian Renaissance is really a huge break from the medieval ages. It is still a religious period. We're still going to see that dominating art. But there's this ongoing interest in the human body and other aspects of the three-dimensional physical world. How do you get from a very flat, weirdly proportioned figure on the left to the amazing Michelangelo portrait sculpture on the right? You get it via Giotto, and I'm oversimplifying, but Giotto was a major breakthrough, right? Giotto's figures are painted with volume because he knows how to use modulated colors, lights and darks and transitions to suggest that there are bodies under those robes. It's not the flat figure of St. Francis, it's these volumetric figures with more natural proportions. And Giotto has eliminated that gold background. He realizes that these figures exist in real space, which has a sky. His landscape is still pretty schematic. It's maybe a little more volumetric, a little more sense of space than what we saw with the Berlinguer, but he's still not giving a lot of attention to realism in the landscape. The figures, yes, are becoming more realistic. The landscape, not yet. But as time passes, artists who are using their eyes to look at the world and then translate what they see the best they can onto a two-dimensional surface are doing it not just for the figures, but also for the landscape. So we have this amazing St. Francis again. But now we really get a sense of his paying attention to the details of what nature looks like and developing the skills he needs to suggest recession into space. So it's not a flat background, the proportions of the figure, the sense of scale for the landscape, all of that comes from experiencing the world, not just learning what your teacher taught you to do in a schematic way. Now, as we go forward, we're now at the High Renaissance. This is Raphael. We again see an artist who can, if he chooses to, depict a landscape. But the point I want to make with this Raphael, Madonna of the Meadow, is that he is still giving priority to the human figure. This is still what the Catholic Church wants, the glorification of the holy figures, in this case, the Madonna, baby Jesus, and John the Baptist as a baby. So, I'll pose a question. When does landscape finally come into its own? And why? But first, let's look at a few examples. This is where we start to get a landscape tradition. and it's in Holland in the 17th century. I want to show you a few examples. Clearly here, you might not even notice right away that figures are included. And they're not holy figures. They seem to be kind of lovers. And I don't know enough about this period to understand why so many of these landscapes will show a couple. It's clearly the artist's intent to depict the landscape. And not just the details of trees and meadows. The sky takes over so much interest. If you know Holland at all, it's a pretty flat country, so you do tend to see a lot of sky. And the artists discover how much interest there is, how much excitement you can find in depicting the sky. A few more examples. This is amazing to me, and before researching this lecture, I'd never heard of that artist. But the challenge he set for himself, doing a nightscape, that's really pretty amazing, to do a landscape at night. Obviously, the moon is providing some illumination, but it's really stunningly beautiful, and I think a really impressive feat to make this amazing painting of the landscape at night. And they did all kinds of landscapes, not just landscapes, but also seascapes. And seascapes, she sells seashells, seascapes under all sorts of circumstances. So you have the drama and the excitement of this seascape. Now, I want to make a few points. My question was, why did this happen? Why, after the Renaissance, with great artists whose names we all know, did there develop this landscape tradition? And it's very easy to see reasons for it, and as I've outlined here for you. The Protestant church was not commissioning artists to do altarpieces with saints or Jesus. The Protestant church was looking back at that famous saying, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image," and following that. So you have these churches. It was still a very religious society, but in the Protestant churches, you do not have these icons. You do not have a market for all these holy figures in altarpieces. Furthermore, if your church is not commissioning you, how did you have artists at all working? Well, again, it goes along with changes in society. There was a growing merchant class because Holland was the site of all this mercantile activity. And if you have mercantile activity, you also need bankers. So merchants of all sorts and bankers had enough money to buy art. And they weren't buying religious art, they were buying secular art. So they're buying landscapes, still lifes, portraits of ordinary people, but we're focusing on the landscapes here. Now, I want to mention one more Dutch 17th century painter. There are so many of them. In fact, the proliferation of artists really starts to take place in this period. You have more people who can buy art, so you have more people who can make a living being artists. And the one I want to talk about is named Jacob van Ruysdael. And this is an interesting painting because in the foreground, you have actually mercantile activity. It's called the bleaching grounds. Apparently, one of the parts of the process involving with textiles was that they would have to bleach the textiles and they would spread them out in the fields. So that's what we're seeing in the foreground. It's interesting to me that there is a church, but it's in the background. The foreground is the moneymakers. The foreground is the patron, probably, who commissioned this painting. I want you to glorify my industrial endeavors here. But also the typical Holland interest in the sky, the amazing sky, and the effects of the sky. Because you see the foreground is dappled. Areas where the sunlight is poking through just so happens to fall on the bleaching grounds that the patron probably, who commissioned this, wanted to highlight his industrial works. And then areas of shade, and then more sunlight. And so it's really someone who is looking at the landscape itself and then the atmospheric effects. Because we all know a landscape looks one way in one sort of light and looks a different way in a different sort of light. So that's something these artists are picking up on. Now, I wanted to mention Jacob van Ruysdael because of this painting. I can almost remember being an undergraduate and having grown up in a Jewish family, thinking, okay, I'm learning all this about Christian religions. That's cool. And finally, we get to a painting that has Jewish in the title. I don't know, it just kind of thrilled me. But it's not really about Jews per se. It's about a Jewish cemetery which actually existed. There was a Jewish community outside of Amsterdam. That's actually not the most important thing about this painting. The most important thing for our purposes is the melodrama here. It's got life and death and hope and despair. You've got the foreground with the cemetery, and you've got a dying tree, and then you have buildings in the background that are decaying, and then you have this stormy sky, but then you have a rainbow. So there's a whole realm of emotional ups and downs in this one painting, which, by the way, is rather large for the landscape tradition in Holland at the time. It's a very large painting and a very powerful, emotionally charged painting, I think. So I'm going to quote someone here. I didn't give it a reference point, but the sublime became a central component of the dramatic landscapes created by the Romantics, the Barbizon School, British landscape painters, members of the Hudson River School, and many others whose work also encourages emotional engagement through the contemplation of life, death, and nature. So the first part of my lecture is trying to show you that for a long time, landscape was just ignored or the background for a religious story. And then landscape starts being depicted representing the world that the painters lived in Holland in the 17th century. But then landscape gains even more power, that it just doesn't have to be a record of something visual that we see. It can be about the human experience of landscape. And that's why I want to show you this painting. Caspar David Friedrich. If we were spending more time on the history of landscape, we would talk about him at length. He was part of the German Romantic tradition that affected both literature and the visual arts. And this is a painting, we think it's a self-portrait of him standing in awe. He's on the precipice of this landscape that's hidden above, in fog. And so we start to get this idea that the painters are not just portraying what they see, but they're starting portraying their emotional reaction to it, giving the landscape a kind of power, or sublimity is the term that they use so much. It's not replacing the sublime that you were supposed to experience in a Gothic cathedral with the beautiful religious icons. It's not replacing religion, but alongside with these religious cultures, they're also getting this feeling of the sublime in nature. Reminds me, I once did a performance piece called True or False, Nature Refreshes the Spirit. And it was an interactive performance where I actually spoke to people who came and asked them if they found nature to be replenishing in some way, or inspiring, or soothing, or calming. And I posed this question because that doesn't do it for me. I have no interest in nature. I'm not comfortable in nature. I grew up inner city, and maybe that's why going out of the house was scary and I didn't do it much. So I'm very happy inside museums, inside my studio, inside. But 99% of the people I spoke with found nature to be inspiring. And so I guess a lot of people can relate to this idea that when you go into nature, it's not just to hunt for mushrooms or whatever else you might do, or not just to get exercise. It's to have an emotional experience, some sort of experience of something greater than you are. How many of you can understand that? Yeah, 99% of the people in this room. I'm the only one. Anyway, it just doesn't do it for me, but that's okay. All right, moving on. We're going to talk about Impressionism. How many of you have heard of Impressionism? Can anybody name a French Impressionist painter? Just shout it out. Okay, good. That's good enough. You all know, you've heard of Impressionism, right? We're going to talk about Impressionism. And as you probably gathered by looking at Impressionist painting after Impressionist painting that's of landscape, landscape was an acceptable subject matter by that point in time. And one's first-hand experience, as I showed you with the David Caspar Friedrich painting, one's first-hand experience of the nature is important, and that brings us to plein air painting. Plein air painting just means that you go outside. Now, I didn't point it out, but all of those paintings that we've looked at until we get to the 19th century Impressionists, generally speaking, those paintings were created in a studio. Those artists might have gone out into nature and made nature studies. We certainly know Leonardo da Vinci made lots of nature studies. But all of those artists that we've talked about until now painted the painting in their studio, not outside. So one of the major breakthroughs of the Impressionist approach is that they would have those portable easels and portable boxes of paints, and they would go out and do plein air, outside, outdoor painting. And that's hugely important, as we'll see when we look at their work. So, as we'll see, because of this approach of actually going into nature, we see a radical shift in the way landscapes are depicted, and that leads to so many changes in the history of Western art. So I put this up here because I assumed you'd all heard of Impressionism. Until maybe 40 years ago, Impressionist paintings were among the most coveted by rich folks who like to spend millions of dollars on paintings. Impressionism was so popular and so prevalent in American museums. The rich people who could afford it brought Impressionist painting over. So I just had to show you, that's a lot of money to spend for a painting. It's a Monet from his Haystack series. But let's talk about Monet. So this painting in, 1872, shame on me. What was I thinking? 1872. I'm glad I caught that and didn't have to hear it from one of you guys. Anyway, 1872. So it's called Impression Sunrise. And I put that particular Monet up there for a couple reasons. One of which is that when we use the term Impressionism, we think, oh, that's the term for those painters. The term came from a derogatory comment. Monet was exhibiting this painting, which he called Impression Sunrise, and a critic said, these paintings, they're not really paintings, they're just impressions. And the group of painters around Monet said, yeah, we're Impressionists. They accepted that criticism and said, yeah, that's what we're doing. So what were they doing? Well, they were doing all kinds of landscapes. This is obviously a big seascape. They were doing intimate scenes. This is one of Monet's paintings of a garden at Giverny. And then, as you probably know, he went on to do water lilies up close. Now, it's fascinating if you think about this. He's getting stranger and stranger. I mean, in this painting, you still have a sense of space. You have an inclination that that must be the sky with the sun in it, and that that must be water. And here you know those are flowers, and they're moving in the distance back toward what must be a house. So you're getting a sense of recession from a foreground to something in the background. And now you've got these water lilies, and he's kind of looking down on the surface. So we have to really be aware of this incredible transition that Monet and other Impressionists were enacting. And it's just one of the major changes. So one of the major changes is this descriptive of what it's really like to go look at boats and water and sunrise? It's not descriptive in the way a Leonardo would describe it or any of the Dutch 17th century painters we looked at before. This is what I was talking about when I was talking about being in nature and experiencing it. What the Impressionists were realizing is if you're outside and you're painting, you're getting glimpses of the sunlight on colors, and you're getting glimpses of changes in the sunlight. It's a completely different way of experiencing nature. You're not using your brain to say, oh, I know that flower. That's a pansy, and it has 3 leaves. You're saying, oh no, when I see that flower, I just see this color, and then I see a split. It's so different in how you are approaching the landscape. You are trying, well, as Cézanne once said, Monet was just an eye, but what an eye. What did he mean by that? Monet is trying to just look at the landscape and be honest about what he's seeing. Not saying, oh, I know that's a tree, so it's got an edge here, and it's got no. When I see that tree, I'm seeing a reflection of that grass, so that tree has a little green in it. You get what I'm after? He really is taking away the brain part. That's what Cézanne was saying. He's just trying to use his eye and not say, I know that's a tree. I know there's a hard edge between the tree and the grass. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to do what my eye tells me. And so we move further and further away from what we had seen in the Dutch 17th century painters. Remember, they were out looking at landscapes, maybe making some notes, but going back into their studio. And they're using their brain to say, I know that windmill had whatever number of, they're using their brain. The Impressionists were just trying to use their eye, work in nature, and respond to effects of light and color flickering all over. To do that, to capture that sense of flickering nature, their brushstrokes become loose and often very visible. So if you go up to many paintings before the 18th century, you don't see the brushstroke. If the guard lets you get your nose up there, you're not going to see a brushstroke. But obviously, if you look at an Impressionist painting, you're going to see the brushstrokes. And why would this happen? Why would the artist stop wanting to give you that detail? This sounds like an oversimplification, but I've been thinking about it for a long time. The invention of photography cannot be overlooked when we talk about the history of painting. So this is a very early photograph, actually a daguerreotype, a predecessor to the kind of photography that we used until we got digital photography. But anyway, you know what I'm saying. The camera quickly starts to be used to do landscapes. I mean, this is amazing. So we have the invention of photography back here. Within a decade or two, we've got people going out and using that big, clunky stuff they had to do photographs out in nature, big glass plates and all the chemicals and all kinds of stuff. But they would do it. Landscape was a common subject for early photographers, and you can get all this detail. And it continues. We can see this amazing work in the United States. Now we're looking at something shot in the United States. The incredible detail and richness of detail. If photography can do that, why would a painter bother? Now that's an oversimplification, but it makes a lot of sense. And art history, I don't know, teaches me over and over again, if you look at all sorts of factors, it all makes sense. So we go from Impressionism to Post-Impressionism. So those loose brushstrokes that I was talking about in the Monet, and certainly so many other Impressionist painters, Van Gogh takes that idea and runs with it. So I'm just showing you one Van Gogh. You all know Van Gogh. You all know that he worked in the landscape like the Impressionists. But for him, the brushstrokes themselves are not just about capturing what the eye sees. The brushstrokes are conveying emotion. So he's going a step beyond Monet being just an eye. Van Gogh is an eye and a soul, a feeling soul who would express angst very many times and energy. He's capturing the energy, not just his own angst. He's actually capturing the energy of growth in nature. I didn't bring a lot of examples because I'm sure you all know Van Gogh. And I also brought in Cézanne because I love him from the bottom of my heart. Cézanne is also going into nature with a sense of freedom. He's not trying to give us the details of nature. He's trying to give us structure. So when you look at a Van Gogh, when you look at a Cézanne, I'd rather look at Cézanne than Van Gogh. If you look at a Cézanne, you're getting a sense of space. This is what's amazing about him. You are getting a sense of space, that there's a foreground, a middle ground, a background, and a sky at the farthest reaches of everything. But you're also getting an incredible exercise in composition. And that's why he's more than just an eye, because he's also trying to structure the surface of the canvas in a fascinating, controlled way. He's like putting together puzzle pieces. All these brushstrokes are not just individual tiny brushstrokes. They're areas. They're like planes. They're like little facets that he's creating. And they all fit together like a puzzle. And you can look at this, I mean, just in the general sense. If we try to analyze this composition, look how he's got a sense of horizontal stripes, basically, in the lower half. And then you have this break and you have this dynamic diagonal of the mountain. And then you almost have a sense of vertical elements to create the sky. And so you've got this, I could translate this into a total abstraction and have a gorgeous composition. And that's what Cézanne was adding. It's the freedom to distort from detailed representations, because photography could do that, but it's also adding structure. So these post-impressionists were definitely on the shoulders of the impressionists, who said, let's go out into nature and not worry about details. Let's go out into nature and experience something. But for Van Gogh, it was conveying the emotion he felt in nature. For Cézanne, it was about creating a structured world on the canvas. So I don't know what a psychiatrist would say about those two different personalities, but remarkably different, but remarkably important. Okay, we're going to move into the 20th century. Why not? And this is a quote from me. I really think if we try to figure out how did artists go from representing things, whether it was a still life, a portrait, or a landscape, to total abstraction. When I say total abstraction, I mean not just the abstracted version of a table. I mean no table in my composition. How do they get there? I think a lot comes from their experiments in the landscape. And I can't prove that here because we don't have enough time because we want to get to some important stuff. So I just want to say that if we look at early 20th century painting that leads us to non-objective or totally abstract painting, we see painters like André Derain, who along with Matisse were part of a group called the Fauves, which means the beasts. And again, it was like the Impressionists. Some exhibition of their work was criticized as being, these artists aren't painters, they're beasts, wild beasts, they're Fauves, and they took the name. So the Fauves painted landscapes like this, where you have the free brushwork of Van Gogh and even crazier colors. They start to go crazy with the colors, totally invented colors. And Kandinsky is another artist who was taking landscape into this very loose, gestural approach. And the story with Kandinsky, who was one of the earliest to go totally abstract, non-objective, is that he walked into a studio one day and one of his landscape paintings was upside down, and he still loved it. He still felt energy and power, and he called spiritual. He wrote a book on the spiritual in art. And he, among others, at the same time, these things happen simultaneously, there are other artists too who realized, wow, even without a representation of something, I can be moved by a painting. I can be excited by lines and shapes and colors and energy that is conveyed without a subject matter. And a similar thing happened with those artists who preferred the structure of Cézanne. So we have a Picasso landscape, but the landscape is getting subsumed by his interest in these flat planes that jostle with each other and create a structure. And it gets to a point, even with his collaborator, Georges Braque, that you hardly even know what is being represented. This is these are pre-Cubist works, and Cubist works always have a supposed subject, but they become very hard to see the subject. And Cubism leads to total non-abstraction, so that's why I say landscape was so instrumental in the development of 20th century abstract. Now we're getting to the stuff you came here for if you care about the climate. We're going to talk about a movement sometimes called land art, sometimes called earth art. We're going to talk about a period of art in the United States, I'm just talking about the United States now, where artists were, for a variety of reasons, creating artworks in the landscape. Not sitting in their studio or not going into the landscape to paint, but to create artworks in nature. Now, there are many reasons, and for each of the artists I'm going to discuss, there are all kinds of circumstances that led to this, but the common thread is they were working at a very specific time, the 60s and the 70s. What else was happening in the 60s and the 70s? I remember this from going to college and being asked to read The Silent Spring. The culture at large in the United States was realizing that we, human beings, were having a bad impact on nature. And so Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring, how many of you are familiar with that book? Anybody as old as me? A couple, you don't have to admit it, it's okay. Important book talking about the effects of pesticides on our lands. Another issue that I don't hear much about it anymore, but we worried about the population explosion. And this book talked about that, not good for Earth or people. Terrible, I was in school in California, a terrible oil spill in Santa Barbara. And eventually, all of these things bring us to the first Earth Day in 1970. So I'm just trying to show you that the period in which the land art movement got going was a period in which society was realizing, whoa, we've got to worry about the environment. And the specific concerns back then, I just picked a few. Air and water pollution we were becoming aware of it. Gosh, I remember what Los Angeles looked like when I got there when did I get there? In the 60s. Smog, unbelievable air pollution. Population explosion, radioactive fallout, food additives, pesticides, and oil spills. So these were a zeitgeist. People were worrying about these things. And so suddenly we get artists going into the land. And I wrote down a few things that got them there. They wanted to increase awareness of our relationship to the natural environment. And I say that it was often created in remote areas. Some of the most important examples, many of which you've probably heard of, are created in places I've never visited, often in the Southwest. And some of them were temporary. Some of these artists built land works that disappeared with the elements, but not all. So we're going to look at the ones that still exist, and we're going to start that those located in more remote locations. How many have heard of Spiral Jetty? Yeah, it's one of the most famous examples of earth art. When he built this, he knew that the water conditions would change and that after a certain point in time it might be submerged. And it was submerged for decades and reemerged and submerged again and reemerged. It's visible now, but he knew that part of the natural cycles in nature would hide it, and that was okay. he was trying to make a point about nature and calling your attention to nature. He unfortunately died in an airplane crash. But before he died, he was married to this woman, Nancy Holt. And this is one of her works in the landscape. And I'm sorry that it takes me until 1973 to talk about a woman artist. That's a whole other lecture, you know, why that's the case. It's not that women aren't talented. There are all kinds of societal reasons that we don't get women artists until society was ready for them. But this is an amazing piece. And at a certain point, it looks like that, where the sun comes through it. And Walter de Maria's lightning field. Now, there's a whole lot of interest in this particular photograph because apparently, you know, lightning field, you think, oh, he built this field. It's 400 stainless steel poles set into the landscape. And they're set such that they're dug down so that the top of the 400 poles is completely flat. So each pole has a different length depending on where in the landscape it was set. But anyway, the problem with this photograph, and the organization that runs it now doesn't use this photograph, apparently too many people were disappointed. They made the trek out there to see lightning field, and no lightning happened, right? And so the organization now tries to promote it as being beautiful in all sorts of weather conditions. So it's beautiful when the sun is setting and reflecting off the poles. There's some criticisms of lightning field because of where it's located and issues with Native American lands, and some people see it as dominating. It's like such a man-made thing with, you know, very rigid structure and man-made poles. So there's some people who feel that this is like the opposite of what nature art should be doing. There's nothing natural about the art itself, but it does get you to go out into nature and experience the atmospheric effects on the work of art. So those are the ones, just a few examples, that were located far, far away. I want to talk about ones here. Some land artists chose to work in the urban environment. So Alan Sonfus created this in 1965. He proposed it in 1965. He wasn't able to really build it until the 70s. But what he did is he studied pre-colonial plants and planted them, and they are still thriving. This photograph was taken not long ago. It's somewhere in Lower Manhattan. I don't remember the street address now. But he was making this amazing point. Let's remember that this island of Mannahatta, or whatever the Indians called it, used to be nature. And it's a really cool way to remind us of what we're living on in that urban landscape now. And one of my favorite examples, a little later than most of the artists we're talking about, she just died, I thought. No, I guess not. Somebody else just died. She didn't die. But she did this amazing, I forgot how many acres of wheat she planted to kind of remind us that farmland is really important. So you can see the Twin Towers in the background, unfortunately. I mean, you know. Anyway, she planted a wheat field to remind us how much we depend on the land, not the urban landscape, but the rural landscape. I just think it's beautiful. It was harvested, and the wheat was distributed. It wasn't wasted. So those are some examples of the artists who were working in the landscape because of these concerns. Those aren't what we hear about much anymore. What do we hear about now? We hear about climate change over and over and over again, and artists are responding. I started to make a list of exhibitions, not just local ones like Bibiana's, of exhibitions around the country in small institutions and big institutions, and it was crazy. There are so many artists working with this issue and addressing the issue of climate change in very creative ways. I'm just going to highlight a few of them. So Olafur Eliasson is a really big name in the art world now. This was his breakthrough piece. It was at the Tate in London. It was called the Weather Project. The Tate has a vast exhibition hall, and they will often invite one artist to do something. This is what he did. He created an artificial sun, and people could come out of the London fog. You know, London has weather like we're having today over and over and over again. So you can imagine how exciting it was for people to come into this space and experience the sun. But when you have an intense experience of the sun, you cannot help but thinking, I think, of global warming. And so that was an underlying concern with this project. He also did another more recent project called Ice Watch. He gathered up pieces of glaciers and brought them to London, Paris, I think Berlin. He did this exhibition multiple times, and he allowed the glaciers to melt in a urban setting, reminding us again of global warming. And if you go online and look up Ice Watch, you can see such powerful, moving images of people responding to the fact, I mean, people get it. They understand what he's saying when we see a glacier melting. So I find his work incredibly powerful and almost always about climate. Again, I can talk about another woman, Maya Lin. You've probably all heard of Maya Lin. When she was an undergraduate at Yale University, she submitted the winning proposal for the Vietnam Memorial. So she's most well known for the amazing Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., a real shocking kind of approach to a memorial, no human figures, no flag-waving figures, just a gash in the earth with walls that list the name of our soldiers we lost. But she's continued to be active, nothing has brought her as much attention, both pro and con. There were people who hated the Vietnam War Memorial. But one of my favorite things she did recently was called Ghost Forest. After one of the big storms, I'm not going to remember which one, there was an area of forest in New Jersey that was devastated. All the trees were dying. So she had this clever, bold idea to take all those trees and bring them and install them in a park in Manhattan. So you can see this view and this view of Ghost Forest. Such a powerful way to make a point that we're killing our planet. Climate change is doing it, but we're responsible for climate change. Now, despite that project, she describes herself as an optimist. And she has done some works that are more uplifting, shall we say. This is what she's done. We can all visit. This is at Storm King. It's an amazing installation. I forgot how many acres big it is, but it's very beautiful. And like the land artist before, she's kind of reminding us, just go out in nature and enjoy nature. It's incredibly beautiful. So my question is, should we be optimistic too? She believes if we really do something that we can save ourselves. And I'm not going to ask you to decide on that now because I wanted to put in a little postscript because I don't want to forget about photography. When I use the word artist, I include photographers, but I've just given a whole lecture called Landscape and Art, and I didn't talk about photography, so I want to make up for that. And I want to point out that people like Ansel Adams used photography to remind us of the extraordinary beauty in nature. And like Leonardo da Vinci, he's very interested in the details of nature, and he had his own system for exploiting the chemicals in the darkroom. You've all heard of a darkroom? It's that thing you used to use to make photographs. And he could really highlight the details in nature by using his scale of lights and darks to create these amazing images that really, this is sublime. I mean, I'll agree. This is really capturing the beauty of nature with all its splendor and power and detail. And Edward Weston would also be in that same category of showing us nature in the detail that a good photographer can capture. And then we get this guy. He's Canadian. And this is a landscape photograph too, right? But what a change. He has made his whole career not about climate change per se, but about showing man's inhumanity to Mother Earth. He does landscapes, if you will, that have been impacted by the Industrial Revolution. And so he's got a whole book called Manufactured Landscapes. The stressful thing for me is that these are beautiful photographs, but he's really talking about something that's a nightmare, you know, what we have done with our industrial, mistakes all over the world. All over the world he travels to create these photographs. Like I say, it's such an emotional seesaw for me because I'm feeling the horror of what he's documenting, but the beauty of the work of art. And then we come to right in our midst. So there are so many photographers who are addressing climate change in our area. I'm just showing you three. Andrew Courtney is a photographer I know well. He's spent his whole life traveling around the world, usually documenting issues of social justice and fighting for social justice, protesting with the protesters, but documenting the protests all over the world. And yet he does take the time to also document what's happening because of climate change. And here's another artist also talking about an amazing storm, way beyond what we'd think of as normal. And a river overflowing its banks. Those are 3 local artists, and they're just, you know, a fraction. In fact, my whole lecture is just about the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more we could talk about for any of the earlier periods that I addressed, from the late medieval period, Renaissance, Holland, Impressionism, but there is so much right now going on. I kind of want to praise the art community for taking this life and death matter seriously and using their art to remind us all of what we need to be doing. So thank you very much. Did I talk too long?